Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, WeissAdvice.com and Weiss Advice here on YouTube. Normally I start with an intro, but I want to prove a point, so I'm going to start by playing down a record first without any of my processing on it at all, and then with my processing on it. Here we go.
Es que no hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, amor. Te quiero más cerca. Te quiero más cerca. Es que no hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, mi amor. Te quiero más cerca. Es que no hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, amor. Te quiero más cerca. Te quiero más cerca. No hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, mi amor. Te quiero más cerca. Te quiero más cerca. Yeah, yeah.
All right, this video is going to be about the importance of workflow. There is this belief that you want to use processors that are dedicated to every individual sound. Every individual source is going to sound best with a certain EQ or a certain compressor, and that's going to be the special sauce on each individual sound. And I want to dispel that completely. I think that if you have one EQ, one compressor, one reverb, one delay, one of each type of signal processor that you just know really well and is extremely conducive to your workflow, that's actually going to produce better results than having hundreds of different plugins and pieces of gear available. We as engineers do tend to like shiny new toys. It's just part of our nature. We see something new and we want to get it. And somehow the more expensive it is, the more we want to get it on top of that. But of course, that is gear acquisition syndrome. It is not actually conducive to getting better results. Better results come from mastering our workflow. The easier it is for us to get what we're hearing in our head to what we're hearing out of the speakers, that's going to produce the best results. Now, the following is going to look like a total sales pitch for the Hoser XT2, so I want to just qualify a couple of things here. One, I do not have a paid sponsorship arrangement with Boz Digital at all. This is not a paid video. Two, I do not have an endorsement deal with Boz Digital, although I really feel like I should have one, because if you've seen my videos, you've seen this EQ probably dozens of times, if not more. Why? Because it is my go-to EQ. It is extremely conducive to my workflow. So in this video, I want to talk about my workflow and just some of the ideas that went into getting this record to sound so much better when I played the second version of it. Okay, so let's start with just why I like this particular EQ. And I do want to qualify that everyone's going to be a little bit different, okay? The most important thing is that you learn yourself. The things that work for you, you embrace those, and you don't really care about what works for anybody else. Now, for me, I like something that functions like an inline channel EQ that you would find on the SSL board. This is not an SSL emulation, by the way, but it functions very similarly. I like that because those are EQs that are designed for getting the job done. You have 4 sets of EQs, four knobs, different points that you can adjust, and they are fully sweepable. They go from very wide band to very narrow band, and they sound good. Are there times where a certain EQ might sound better, where you would normally go to like your hardware rack or whatever? Yeah, sure. But for the most part, this is going to get the job done on basically any source. It's very utilitarian. So I really like that. I think that for me personally, this plugin sounds better than the software SSL emulations. I have not tried every software SSL emulation. I have not tried every EQ that kind of lays out like an SSL. Again, this is not an SSL emulation. I'm just saying functionally it's very similar. This one sonically works for me, so I go with that. But then the rest of it is really function. One, it doesn't default to having an analyzer on. I hate that. I do want to say, not to discourage you from embracing your own workflow, but I do feel that if your workflow is improved by having an analyzer on, some kind of a visual stimulation, chances are you're using that as a crutch, and I do discourage at least I do discourage that. I encourage at least examining, trying to find a way to do it without a visual input and just relying on your ears. I think that will be better. So I don't like having a lot of bright lights. I don't like it blinking. I don't like a lot of stimulation coming into my eye here. I want to hear my results. Following that, there's just certain things that I really like, especially about the new update here. I like that the in and output are linkable so that you can control the amount of saturation that you are getting from the EQ. I do not like a sterile EQ as my go-to, but I also do not like a heavily colored EQ as my go-to either. I like something that has its own flavor, but it's subtle. This checks that box. Having this linkable in and out is really nice because it allows me to control exactly how much of that color I want. So you can see here on the bass, I've pumped the input all the way, the output's almost all the way down, and that's so that I can get more saturation out of it. However, on other sources, like on my vocal, I stacked up 2 EQs, and on the second one, you can see it's the exact opposite. The input's all the way down, the output is all the way up, and that's to get as minimal saturation from this second EQ as possible. So that's really, really nice. Having the high pass right in line, then we get our 4 different parametric knobs, fully sweepable, go from wide to narrow. Perfect. Anything that I can get done, that I need to get done, I can get done. And as an added bonus, it also has a mid-side. That's not the most important thing in the world to me, but the few times where having a mid-side is important, it is really nice to just be able to click and pull this into mid-side mode. Although I don't use a lot of mid-side EQ, but sometimes. Okay, so with all that said now, let's actually get into the nitty-gritty of what we've got going on here. I'm going to mute the lead vocal because the lead vocal needs the most work. Not surprising, it is the only acoustically recorded instrument in this mix, and that's where things tend to get a little bit funky. But here we have just the actual production itself. So before we do any EQing, we want to have an idea of what we want just listening to it. So right off the bat, I do think that it's pretty good. I think that if it was unchanged completely, it would still sound good and could still be potentially a hit record. And that's good. That's where we want our productions to be, ideally. I do think that there's a couple little things that need to be switched up. These trim plugins are literally just polarity switches. There's no actual level adjustment, but I'm just going to flip these in because getting a better relationship, better phase relationship is going to improve things. And you can hear it's basically the same, but we get a little bit more punch from the kick. So, okay, not a third-party plugin, not the Hoser XT2. It's a trim plugin, which you will find in literally every other DAW, and Pro Tools as well. So now, what are we going to do? First, we want to figure out where we want to start. Where you start is part of your workflow. It's personal to you. It's whatever strikes you as being the thing you want to start with. For some people, it's going to be low end. For some people, it's going to be drums. For some people, it's going to be like a personality element. For some people, it's going to be vocals. For me, in this particular record, it is the drum loop. So I'm going to mute the bass, and I'm going to mute all of the other drums, and I'm going to mute my instruments as well. And we're left with literally just this. To me, this is the heart of the drums, and the drums is the heart of the record. So, we have a choice. We have an idea. We could leave this as is. Nothing wrong with that decision. It sounds kind of lo-fi, sounds kind of sampled. That's great. We could lean into that. We could throw on some kind of a distortion. We could do some band limiting with an EQ. We could pull up some frequencies that might sound a little bit out of place, but feel good. All of those are perfect options, or we could go the opposite direction. We could kind of re-hi-fi it a little bit and do what I call hi-fi lo-fi, where you take something that is innately lo-fi, but then you hi-fi it through primarily EQ. And in this particular case, because of the nature of this record, I'm going to go in that direction, and that is a choice. It's an idea. The EQ that I pick is not nearly as important as having the idea. Now, I need an EQ that's going to facilitate that idea. So I need an EQ that's going to be able to handle the job. The job, in my opinion, is restoring a ton of top end and a little tiny bit of low mid, while at the same time cutting some sub. Now, that's not necessary to the sound itself. That's just going to be necessary to getting it to agree with the layered in kick drum that I'm going to bring in right after. So here's our before and after, and this is going to be a pretty dramatic change. Right, obviously a pretty big difference here. Suddenly that tambourine becomes a lot more apparent, and the definition of the snare and higher frequency color of the snare becomes a lot more dramatic as well. It becomes much more hi-fi. So everything that I do following this move starts from this choice. It is a domino effect, so getting this sound to be what I want it to be, really, really important. Next step, bringing in the kick. I think the kick sounds great. The only thing I want to change ever so slightly is that it sounds a little bit more like an EDM kick than like a reggaeton kick. So I'm going to push a little bit of 230 hertz to give it a little bit more of that sort of forward tone that a reggaeton kick would have. It's a very, very slight change. Nothing else is being done here. Next, the snare. So the snare, I'm going to emulate the same moves that I did on the drum loop. The snare sounds very similar to the one that's in the loop. It might even be a chop of the one that's in the loop. So I'm going to add that same 244 hertz. I'm also going to add that almost 10K, although I'm going to add a little bit less of it. It's only going to be a 4 dB shelf. And then the one difference here is that I'm also going to add a little bit here at about 1K, like 1.2K. I'm going to add 2.5 dB. So this is all just going to make the snare pop forward. Okay, next, the clap. So here, the clap sounds great. I don't think that I need to change the clap. The question is there a reason why I would want to? If I want the clap to stand on its own and be its own unique element and pop out, I just leave it as is, and it sounds perfect. If I want the clap to blend in with the other drums and sort of feel like they're a texture that's gluing in to the rest of the drums, then I feel like I need almost the exact opposite EQ curve of what it naturally is. Right now, there's a good amount of like center mid, like a good amount of 500 and a good amount of 1K, and it's living right in the space that the other drums have left open for it. So if I want it to kind of glue in and get along with the other drums and sort of be a little more invisible, I'm going to need to cut those frequencies, and that's going to be what I'm doing with this EQ. So it's a pretty big difference here. I'm cutting 6 dB at about 500 hertz, and I'm cutting 15 dB at 1K. So, I mean, I'm really transforming the sound, but I think you'll pick up what I'm putting down after I bring this in and out. All right, here we go. Before. And I prefer it with the EQ, and I'll tell you why. I prefer it that way because I feel like it's leaving a really nice big pocket open for some kind of central instrument, which is going to end up being the guitar later down the road, to live in. And I think that's going to work better. It's going to make for a bigger sounding record. Now, I do also have to say that just bypassing it and bringing it back on like every bar kind of had a cool sound too. So, you know, that idea is perfectly legit also, to bypass it and then bring it on so that the clap lives in two different places. That creates a really nice dynamic and would not be a bad choice for this record either. All right, let's bring in our hi-hat. The hi-hat's a little dark sounding, and right now it's a little low, but I kind of like that it's just sort of providing energy. I think that it actually works, although it's not how we would typically hear it. I think that it works as is, so I'm just going to leave it. Now, with all of that done, I've got my main drums out of the way. There are some other drums that come in. We'll address those later. But this is our main drums, so now I want to get the foundation of the record down and get the bass in. So here's our bass. So I think the bass sounds pretty good, but it's a little bit overly rounded. It's a little too filtered and rolled off. So I think I want to first push some saturation into it. So I've got my input turned all the way up and I've got my output turned almost all the way up. It's 1 dB higher. For whatever reason, when it was matched, it felt like the bass came down in level a little bit. I'm not really sure why. So this sounded more matched to my ear. And then I'm pushing a bunch of 300 hertz. 300 hertz is almost like the nose of this bass. It's what kind of allows us to know, like, oh, this is a square bass. Cool. So here's our before and after. So I think that's really important for the color of the bass. It's also important for the note of the bass, especially these slides. Without that EQ, we don't really hear the slides so well. Right, so we lose a little bit of movement, we lose a little bit on that turnaround. Nice. I also do have a little bit of the high pass in at about 30 hertz. That's really more to control just some of the more flubby notes that hit when we get down into like the low notes of this bass. Sometimes the sub gets a little out of control. So what I'm really doing with this is actually sort of controlling 60 hertz, but I'm just doing it from a much lower corner frequency and allowing the very gentle slope of this high pass to very, very modestly roll off some 60 hertz. So just a little point there. But again, knowing your EQ is really a big part of that, because if I knew that this was a steeper high pass, this wouldn't work. All right, let's bring in our main instrument, which is this guitar. So this guitar has a little bit of a lo-fi-ish kind of thing going on if I solo it. I like it, but I might clean it up. Like if I didn't have instruction or an idea and someone was just like, make this sound better, I might ever so slightly roll off a little bit of those central mids and lows, maybe add a touch of highs. And so, you know, little 2-3 dB changes here. So I might go in that direction. However, this is again a choice. I actually kind of like the lo-fi side of it. I like that it's bulked up in the mids, so I kind of want to lean into that a little bit. I'm going to band limit the guitar. I'm going to roll off a ton of lows. So from 175, I'm going to roll off 8 dB, and this is a pretty broad slope. So I mean, this is going to be covering stuff all the way up to like 400 hertz easily. And then also doing the same thing from the upper mids into the treble, rolling off about 8 dB. And then I'm going to be boosting my output here by about 8 dB. It looks like actually only 7 dB in this particular case, but then I'm also adding about just a tiny pinch, just like a dB at about 780, where there's like this really nice color that shows up. So I'm taking what the guitar is already doing and I'm basically exaggerating it. It sounds like this. Here's our before. After. You can hear a lot of those like kind of room resonancy tones become a little bit more exaggerated. The colorful stuff in the mids gets exaggerated, but the bottom and top kind of stay in place. That's what's going on here. I don't think in solo it's an improvement to the sound, but when I hear it in the context of the mix, I'll bring it in and out as I play through. I think you'll agree that it actually kind of does something cool. So it really fills in that gap that the drums are leaving. That central mid space now has one element that's really dominating it. And does it sound a little dirty and a little weird? Yeah, it does, but it kind of feels good, so I'm going to go with that. Let's bring in some of the other elements. Other elements are really basic. Vocal chop here didn't get any kind of adjustment. There's a little bit of EQ going on the pluck. A little bit of mid-side stuff where I'm really boosting the top end of the sides, but you barely hear it, believe it or not. It's because there's not a lot there, basically. And then, like, you know, I guess there's the big move here is a lot of 500 hertz. So it's really going to fill up that 500 hertz range before and after. So despite that crazy looking EQ move, it actually really the only difference that we end up hearing is that the pluck becomes a little bit more defined because that 550 hertz range still has a little space in it that we can fit the pluck into. Now moving on to the other drums here, we have a chorus ride. I think that sounds great. No need to change it. This bell. To me, that sounds too narrow when we hear it in context. It's carrying a lot of the beat, so I want it to be a fuller sound. What I'm doing is I'm taking all the energy is kind of bunched up around like the upper mids. So I'm cutting a bunch of the upper mids, I'm cutting some of the highs, and I'm putting energy down into the central mids and low mids so that it feels fuller and fatter. And same kind of thing with this timbale here. It's sitting a little narrowly, so I'm cutting where it feels narrow, like where the energy feels like it's bulked up, which is around 2K, and then I'm boosting up some 1K and just boosting up the overall level. And maybe I might want to go back and kind of like ever so gently roll off some of the lows. And by lows, I mean like 400 hertz because there's not a lot of like deep lows in this. But outside of that, it feels pretty good. Hi. All right, so let's get on to the vocal now. This is the missing piece of the puzzle right here.
Lo siento por dentro, amor, te quiero más cerca, te quiero más cerca.
So this vocal is a mess. It's not a good microphone choice, and the proximity is way too close.
No hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, amor, te quiero más cerca, te quiero más cerca.
There's a really distinct narrow resonance that's happening somewhere in the mids. There's it's way too like woofy and dark. So we need to really adjust this. Basically what I'm going to do here is I'm going to roll off a ton of lows, 8 dB of lows. But again, you know, that might sound crazy, but like listen to how dark it is.
No hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, amor, te quiero más cerca.
Here's our narrow resonance right over here at 650 hertz, basically, cutting that down. Little bit of annoying stuff here, like a very narrow peaky resonance at like 13K, and a very slight bit of buildup here around like 7K. So here's our before and after.
No hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, amor, te quiero más cerca, te quiero más cerca.
So it's like a blanket just gets lifted off of the vocal. So let's play it in context.
No hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, amor, te quiero más cerca, te quiero más cerca.
And that by itself is actually pretty darn good. I don't think that it necessarily needs something, but I do feel like it still is lacking a little bit of jazz. Like it needs a bit of vibe. So I'm going to roll off some of that super top. The super top does not sound very good in this capture to me. So I'm going to roll off some of the super top with a very, very crunchy, distorty sounding filter. That's why I'm using the Digi Lo-Fi here for my filter, and then setting the anti-aliasing filter at about 50%. And that ends up sounding like this.
No hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, amor, te quiero más cerca.
So you hear some funkiness happening. I'll do a before and after.
No hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, amor, te quiero más cerca. No hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, amor, te quiero más cerca. Te quiero.
But as soon as I do that, the top end feels like it needs to fill out again, and the low end feels like it's getting a little bit woolly. So this is a little bit more of that kind of hi-fi, lo-fi thought process, where it's like, now that I've got the personality that I want, I'm now going to adjust the top end, pull up about 5 dB that I've lost on the high frequencies, then attenuate around 3K. 3K ends up getting pulled up and becomes a little annoying, so this cut is kind of making up for this boost. And then some of that woolliness, we're going to cut that out as well, around 460 hertz. So before and after.
No hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, amor, te quiero más cerca. No hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, amor, te quiero más cerca. Te quiero más cerca.
Now there is an overtone that's very high up. It's this very airy, kind of zippy tone. I used to be inclined to kind of get rid of that stuff, but more and more I've been starting to appreciate those kind of sounds. I'm starting to like them, so I'm going to leave it in. And all in all, it sounds like this.
No hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, amor, te quiero más cerca. Te quiero más cerca.
Now let's add some reverbs.
No hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, amor, te quiero más cerca. Te quiero más cerca. Es que no hay otra nona like you.
I like the vibe of the reverb, but it's a little bit bulky. It feels like there's a little bit of weird resonances that are building up in those reverbs.
No hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, amor, te quiero más cerca.
So I'm going to EQ the reverb returns. You know, I'm going to pull out anything that I don't like, some of that 1K stuff, some of that like high frequency stuff. We're going to get rid of it, and we're going to end up with this.
No hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, amor, te quiero más cerca. Te quiero más cerca.
Much smoother sounding. So one more time without.
No hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, amor, te quiero más cerca.
With.
No hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, amor, te quiero más cerca.
So smoothing out those reverbs, and it ends up sounding like this altogether.
No hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, amor, te quiero más cerca. Te quiero más cerca. Es que no hay otra nona like you. Lo siento por dentro, mi amor, te quiero más cerca. Te quiero más cerca. Yeah, yeah.
So that's the basic walkthrough of the mix with only one EQ, really. Like 2 instances of the stock lo-fi and a couple instances of the trim utility plugin, but otherwise literally just one EQ. And then my reverbs. So there you go. All right, if you dig this video, hit that like button. If you want to catch more videos like this, hit subscribe with the bell notifications so you get notified. If you want me to get an endorsement deal with Boz Digital, because after like 7 years of using this EQ in pretty much every tutorial, I should probably get one. Hit that like button. Lastly, you know what we say here at Weiss Advice. We are musicians. Sound is our instrument, and I will catch you next time.